Hello class, this is Jackson. Today we're talking about Zaps labs, specifically the serial position effect Zaps lab. This is based on the research question that identifies what we can remember the most, specifically what we can remember the most when presented with a series or list of words or items. What position in these lists are we most likely to recall after a period of time? Is there an association with where the word is presented, or is it simply what the word itself is? Interestingly enough, the research has shown that there are two main effects that we look at when being presented with a series or list of words that help us encode information. The first one is the primacy effect. The primacy effect is the idea that the first few items in a series that we are presented with, we are more likely to remember because these are most likely to be encoded into our long-term memory. The recency effect is the idea that we are most likely, even more so than the primacy effect, to remember the most recent items in a series of lists because these are still fresh in our mind. As a result, they are still in our working memory, and there is no distractions to remembering those items. As a result of these two main effects, we expect to see a curve in the results when presented with a list or series of information or terms. At the beginning, we are fairly likely to remember the first few items in the list, but there is a quick drop-off where the middle items in the list we are fairly unlikely to remember. That gives way to a rise in the frequency at which we recall information later in the list, with the highest likelihood of recall occurring for the last few items of the list. In this particular version of the serial position effect experiment, we were presented with 4 different groups of 12 words. They were presented on a blank screen, one after the other, for a short period of time. After the first list of 12 terms, we were expected to write down all of the terms we could recall. Then we were to select next, and we were given a new selection of 12 words presented one after the other. In this particular study, the independent variable was the location that each word was placed in the list, whether it was at the beginning, the middle, the end, so forth, what position 1 through 12 it had. The dependent variable was the rate at which we as participants were able to recall that word. As you can see in the data on the screen here, the class data fits the curve that we talked about earlier fairly well. The first few items are remembered at a high frequency, and the last few items are remembered at a high frequency. However, there is a fairly significant drop in the middle of the list. My data, on the other hand, does not directly follow this trend. The first 2 items were remembered quite well, as according to the primacy effect. The last few items were remembered fairly well, according to the recency effect. However, I had a very high recall of the middle 2 items in the list, as well as a slightly lower than expected recall of the very last item of the list. Despite this, I think the results of the study and the procedure of the study fit what the research question was trying to identify. I think the question was performed correctly, and I think my results, compared to the class results, are likely abnormal. The class results resulted from 19 different individuals in the study and followed a fairly expected curve. As a result, I do think this was a fair test of the underlying theory that the recency effect and the primacy effect are cause of higher recall rates for items early on and late in a list or series of words or phrases. I think an interesting study that we could further this research would be on the timing of each word presented. If you were to stagger how long each word was presented for, the items early on in the list being presented for a short period of time, the items in the middle of the list that we typically forget being presented for a slightly longer period of time, followed by the items later in the list once again being presented for a shorter period of time. It would be interesting to see if this affects the overall recall rate of the general population for items in a list.